Come, come, whoever you are, and be welcome. Come whether you are a wanderer or a worshiper, whether you are a lover of leaving or someone who is passionate about community. Come whether you come from the north or the south, the east or the west. Come into this space. Seek to be open to the wholeness. Seek to find unity and universality, to find love and power and change. All are welcome, no matter your heritage, no matter your history. If you are open to the truth, open to the love, whether you return God's love by loving other people or don't have any sense of what God is, you are welcome here. Be welcome. Worship what is of greatest worth and be one with these people. We gather together by singing a song together. I have chosen a song we sang last week. Again, a long-standing hymn of Unitarians and Universalists. 114, forward through the ages. Let us rise in spirit or in body to sing. And now a story. Are there children who would like to come up? Children or tigers? So on the cover of the order of service, you have a woman, old woman. She was a Unitarian Universalist. She joined Unitarian Universalist Church back in the 1800s, so more than, it was like 150 years ago, long time ago. So this is late in her life. That's a picture of what she looked like late in her life. And then here's a picture of her when she was much younger. I still have my little heart sticker from yesterday's ceremony. But there's a picture of her. That's Frances. She started as Frances Ellen Watkins. And this is when she's still Frances Ellen Watkins. And then here's a drawing that someone did of her recently when she's kind of a young adult, a young woman. And then here's a picture of her. And here's a picture of her when she was a very young person. She was a teenager at that point. That's a picture of Frances Ellen. Frances Ellen was born into the United States in a time where people could be owned as slaves. Right now we think that is a terrible thing, that no human being should ever be allowed to own another human being or control their lives. It's a bad thing. And so when Frances Ellen was only 14 years old, she had to leave her house and she had to go find a job. And she found a job in a family, in a household, where she would do the laundry and do some other cleaning and things like that. But it was a family of Quakers who owned a bookstore, and they loved books. And when they found out that Frances Ellen was smart and that she loved to read, they started sharing books with her. And then they found out that she wrote poems, and they loved her poems. They said, you have to share these. And they told her you should go publish them and put them in journals. And so she got them first in journals that were only, papers that were only read by black people. But eventually she was able to publish her poems, and people listened to them, especially the people who didn't like slavery, because she wrote about what it meant to be a slave. She talked about the mothers whose children were taken from them. Her father was a minister of a Methodist church, and so he told her that God had given her powers not only to be a great person, but to make the world better. It's very much like all Unitarian Universalists, that we believe in these powers that we have, not only to be great people, to be good people at least, but also to make the world a better place. As she grew into being an adult and she had a daughter, she was looking around at who it was that was working on fighting and ending slavery, and she found the Unitarians were often at her side. Unitarians were often showing up, and not all of them, but there were some of them who were there, and she liked those people. And so she joined the Unitarian Church, and that was when she was 45, and so for another 40 years, the last 40 years of her life, she lived as a Unitarian Universalist. She always remained part of the African Methodist Church as well, but she was a Unitarian Universalist, and I wanted you to know about her. I wanted you to think about this African American who 150 years ago was part of our movement. I want you to, and more importantly, I want you to think about what you're able to do. Frances Ellen was able to be a writer and a speaker and an organizer. Maybe you're not good at those sort of things. Maybe you're good at math or coding. Maybe you're good at something else, but Make that be part of what makes you a great person, and make sure that you're using your skills, using all that's good in you to help others and make the world a better place. Go off to your classes, enjoy your classes. Remember, we're always one community even when we're in different rooms. Pursue peaceful ends through peaceful means. We shall hew out of the mountain of despair a stone of hope. These words resonate as we sit together in silent meditation or in silent prayer. I wanted you to look at this picture. I picked this up at a protest right after the Parkland shootings. It's an image. I want you to think about this woman, this young woman that you can see in this picture, and what are your basic assumptions? Just notice what you assume about who she is, what you assume about her life. Of course, when I saw this picture, one of the first things I thought of were friends of mine, people that I knew in St. Louis, Missouri during the Ferguson Uprising. I knew one woman. She was a little older than this, in her 30s. She had 2 children, a good husband, and one night she heard some sounds outside in the street outside her house, and she looked out the window, and someone who was in a car there shot at her, and the bullet went through her arm. We held up her name that weekend, and she was the wife of the custodian of the church in St. Louis, and she was honored and a part of our community. She was one of us when she was hit. But then immediately I thought of Unitarian Universalists. How many of you immediately thought, or fairly quickly thought, oh, I bet that's a Unitarian Universalist? It's kind of, I don't know if you can all see who she is. Right? Right? Did you think, oh, I bet that's one of the UUs out there? No. So oftentimes we don't. And right now we're working really hard. Yesterday we ordained Jessica Rockers. We have many people more of color who are starting to come in and looking at being ordained, and we know from past experience that when all the people that we talk about in that heritage, that long chain of the chain of people who have marched through the ages, if all we talk about are people like Lloyd Jenkins Jones and Andrew Greeley and Ralph Waldo Emerson, and they're all white males, it's harder for people of color to become ministers and to stay as ministers in the Unitarian Universalist Association. It matters what you think. And here is Frances Ellen, born Watkins, known more famously as Frances Ellen Harper, because she was married and added on her husband's name. She didn't change her name so much as just added on his name later in her life. Frances Ellen was a powerful, well-known, well-respected, skillful, talented organizer, leader, active in the world, writer, a beautiful writer. She knew the language, the poetic language of her time, and used it well, used it powerfully to awaken people's conscience and change the world. We should be honoring her. We should remember her and claim her as part of our heritage. Usually on Martin Luther, I call this Civil Rights Sunday to expand it. I'm always saying, let's get beyond Martin Luther King Jr. He was very active for 10 years. He was a powerful center of a movement, but don't center the whole movement on him. I'm often talking about the women, the hundreds of thousands of women without whom he would have been a good speaker. Right? The movement was run by people, women and men of all sorts, powerful people who joined in. We should remember that. And I always try to expand our awareness who was part of that movement and how it happened. People, white men of power, were part of that movement, as well as those who suffered the most. This, of course, is a tough time to be a straight white male. I recently was reading about a very alt-right conservative commentator who often talks about his pride of being a white man, and there's a New York Times reporter, a woman of of Korean descent, and she was tweeting mean, angry things about white men, and he got all offended. And he had the gall to compare her giving insults to white men as being the same as that he compared himself to the Jews in Nazi Europe, in Nazi Germany. He was willing to, by being very blinkered and not paying attention to anything, was able to identify with the Jews, at least for a brief moment. Last June, I went to General Assembly, our National Assembly. And it was exciting for me because it felt different. For a long, long time, since the 60s, we have always had a white woman who is the moderator, the lay person, the volunteer who's running the organization, the General Assembly, and then the president was generally a white male, usually a minister. Last year, we had co-moderators, one of whom, Mr. Barb Grieve, is a transgender guy, female, male, just a transgender person. And then the other person is a powerful, Elandria Williams, powerful black woman, but instead of taking on the sort of norms of corporate culture, of the standard culture of America, there was a sort of openness and informality. It was a different feel. The whole culture felt different. And if what you were doing was going to General Assembly and expecting a well-run business meeting, and you got something else, it might have been disturbing, but Unitarian Universalists have always been boundary crossers. We're always willing to step over those bounds and see things changing and be excited about a greater unity and a greater connection and greater powers. And it was an exciting time for me. For me, it was a moment where I was coming into the world that I'd always dreamed of, or at least I could see it and feel it a little bit more closely. It was an entire worship service largely in Spanish. It was great. But we have to keep asking ourselves as Unitarian Universalists, why have there been so few people of color? If Frances Ellen Harper joined us back in the 1800s, why have there been so few? Reverend Mark Morrison Reed did a great service to us by going back through the history and starting to uncover Ethelred Brown and others. I remember there's one man who came to the Universalist convention back in the 1800s and said he was going to preach the Universalist message to the people enslaved, the people who had not been yet liberated, and the Universalist church gave him $500 and said, "Good luck." That was the end of his story. What is it that we do right? And how is it that we have failed to confront our own complicity and involvement in the systems of segregating people and identifying people by color and race in ways that divide and weaken all of us? And we gain some insight by looking at these two people, Frances Ellen Watkins Harper and Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. These two people both knew Unitarian Universalists, were involved with the Unitarians, but took their very different paths. Both, of course, were theistic Christians. It's a big difference. When Frances Ellen joined our movement, we were largely theistic Christians. They were both Martin King and Frances Ellen had theologies that were a little bit, were at least Unitarian leaning, that de-emphasized Jesus as a fusion of the ultimate God and a person, and much more as a person who is an exemplar and a guide and a teacher about how we should live on this earth. Both of them had that same understanding that God and Jesus were not exactly co-equal, and were willing to distinguish between the two. Martin Luther King Jr., in fact, for his doctoral dissertation, wrote about a Unitarian Universalist, a Unitarian at that time. He wrote about the Lutheran Paul Tillich, and he wrote about the Unitarian theologian Henry Nelson Wyman. He knew this process theology. He knew the creative learning spirit theology of Henry Nelson Wyman, but he rejected it. And he rejected it because he was a personalist. And I think it wasn't just that he himself was a personalist. I think he knew that most people in this country thought of God as a person. A personalist is someone who thinks that God has to be a person. If you're going to love God and God's going to love you, God has to be a person, has to have a personality. This is King's argument. It wasn't, I could argue with him theologically about the necessity and that, but I think really what he understood was that his preaching, his theology, if it was truly going to reach a lot of people, needed to be grounded in that understanding of God. And it's something that challenges us because he went to Unitarian worship. And then when he called people to Selma, when he asked religious people to come to Selma, many Unitarian Universalists showed up. And we know James Reeb and Orloff Miller and Clarke Olson, 3 Unitarian Universalist ministers, were beaten. And James Reeb was killed by white activists who didn't want them there. And King memorialized those people. When Viola Liuzzo was shot, she was a member of a Unitarian Universalist church. She was eulogized in her family's Catholic parish, and Martin Luther King was there. He knew Unitarian Universalists. He had worked with them. He knew they were in the organization, but he chose to be a Baptist. And he had gone to Unitarian worship even before he graduated with his doctoral degree, long before he became part of Ebenezer Baptist Church. He knew us, but chose to go a different direction. Frances Harper worked with all the great reformers of her day, everyone from Elizabeth Cady Stanton to Frederick Douglass. She knew all the Unitarians who were great abolitionists. She saw them as allies. She knew they were white people who were doing something about the evil in the world and willing to change it. She worked with William Sill, who founded the Underground Railroad, and may have even met Theodore Parker, who was an active member of and part of one link in that railroad, that helping people escape from slavery, get to Canada, where there was no slavery. Her good friend Peter Clarke, a noted abolitionist and educator in Ohio, was also black, and he joined a Unitarian church in 1868 and encouraged her to join, which she did in 1870 in Philadelphia. Of course, her joining Unitarians was as much about politics as faith. She knew where the power was. She knew who the people were that could make a difference in the world, and she joined with them. She never stopped giving money and participating in African Methodist Episcopal Church services. The AME church is an interesting one. Richard Allen had converted to Methodism, and then they said, "Come into the kingdom of God." They were welcoming him in. Black man, he felt like, "Oh, I'm," and the vision of Jesus as a affirming salvific power of love in the world was moving to him, and he joined that church. And then he found out, oh well, so it turns out that in heaven you get to sit in the back row and don't touch any of the white people. And so he left and joined and created. He and so many others out of several black denominations created one single powerful, and which became one of the strongest black churches in this country. It's interesting, Unitarian Universalists refused to segregate. We refused to be segregated, at least consciously we refused to segregate, and so we never created black churches. We never allowed there to be black Universalist or black Unitarian churches. We always said, oh, we're all here together, and yet because we were living out of segregated cultural norms, we ended up reinforcing segregation, and it's really, I think, the most significant factor for why there have been so few black people, is that unconsciously we continued to affirm segregation and division. Both King and Harper used their celebrity, their skill. They were both excellent speakers. They were both powerful figures. They were both intelligent people. They were both insightful and leaders and organizers. They understood the importance of leading and organizing and creating structures to change the world. And they used their power for the benefit of others and rarely sought honor for themselves. Martin King famously wrote, yes, if you want to say I was the drum major, say that I was the drum major for justice. Say that I was the drum major for peace, that I was a drum major for righteousness. And Frances Harper wrote in her famous poem, one of her most famous poems, Bury Me in a Free Land, she said, I ask no monument, proud and high, to arrest the gaze of passers-by. All that my yearning spirit craves is bury me not in a land of slaves. Always she was thinking of others and holding up the experience of others, those she wanted to help and uplift. She understood her own power and used it for the benefit of others. And both of them understood that the struggle for justice and the struggle for freedom was never merely to uplift a particular minority. Both of them understood that the movement was to uplift everyone together in unity. In 1967, King said in a sermon about the man that Jesus called a fool, injustice everywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality. We are tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. Anyone who lives inside the United States can never be considered an outsider anywhere. But 100 years before that, 100 years before he gave his 67 speech in 1866, in her speech to the National Women's Rights Convention, she said, we are all bound up together in one great bundle of humanity, and society cannot trample on the weakest and the feeblest of its members without receiving the curse in its own soul. King and Harper both chastised the white people of their day who did not feel the urgency of the struggle and who did not join in it. King wrote, I must confess, I've been greatly disappointed with the white moderate. He's writing this from inside a jail cell, right? I have almost reached the regrettable conclusion that the Negro's great stumbling block in his stride forward for freedom is not the white citizens' council or the Ku Klux Klaner, but the white moderate who is devoted more to order than to justice, who prefers a negative peace, which is the absence of tension, to a positive peace, who lives by the mythical concept of time. Shallow understanding of people of goodwill is more frustrating than absolute misunderstanding from people of ill will. But 100 years before that, 100 years before, in 1866, Frances Ellen Harper, speaking to those women at that National Women's Convention, looking them in the face, she said, you white women speak here of rights. I speak of wrongs. I, as a colored woman, have had in this country an education. There exists this brutal element in the society which tramples upon the feeble and treads down the weak. Thus I tell you that if there is any class of people who need to be lifted out of their airy nothings and selfishness, it is the white women of America. So it's a woman speaking to other women. She knew how to call them out. She knew how to be direct. King always spoke about moral uplift, the moral and spiritual nature of the struggle, this long struggle, hundreds and hundreds of years it will take. And Frances Watkins Harper, in her story in 1859, a story called The Two Offers, had one character say, talk as you will of women's deep capacity for loving, of the strength of her affectional nature. I do not deny it. But will the mere possession of any human love fully satisfy the demands of her whole being? Woman, the true woman, if you would render her happy, her conscience should be enlightened, her faith in the true and right be established, and scope be given to her heaven-endowed, God-given faculties. She spoke about moral uplift, about moral courage and strength of character. And both of them, King and Harper, understood the need for protest. King, of course, became famous leading the Montgomery bus boycott, and from 1955, 1956. There's a story told that Francis Watkins once got on what was the 1800s version of a bus, a carriage, a horse-drawn carriage, a large carriage with many seats in it, and she refused to sit on the black side. She sat on the white side. And the people got angry with her and then refused to take her money, so she threw it on the floor of the carriage. Long before Rosa Parks, she was protesting. In the 1850s, this is just before the Civil War, she supported a movement called Free Produce, which encouraged people to boycott all products tied to slave labor. In 1859, she proclaimed, "Oh, could slavery exist long if it did not sit on the commercial throne?" She wrote, "Our moral influence against slavery must be weakened and our testimony diluted if we are constantly demanding rice from the swamps, cotton from the plantations, and sugar from the deadly mills." She was part of the Underground Railroad. She believed in the power of struggle. King always affirmed the power of nonviolent civil disobedience and protest. It is part of what I love about King, what I find inspiring about King, his understanding that the means by which we create peace must be peaceful. But here Frances was a little different. She lived in a different America before the Civil War. She saw the violence firsthand. She understood the cryings of the mothers whose babies were torn from their arms. She understood. And in a letter, 1859, she wrote a letter to the revolutionary John Brown after he was arrested for leading an attack on the arsenal at Harper's Ferry, trying to arm black people against the violence that was being drifted upon them, dropped upon them daily. And she wrote to John Brown and she said, "In the name of the young girl sold from the warm clasp of her mother's arms to the clutches of a libertine or profligate, in the name of the slave mother, her heart rocked to and fro by the agony of her mournful separations, I thank you, John Brown, that you have been brave enough to reach out your hands to the crushed and blighted of my race. I hope from your sad fate, great good may arise to the cause of freedom." In order to engage in the struggle, you have to understand that we need to protect kids more than guns. And to engage in the struggle, you have to know the people and hear the struggles and hear the sorrows and identify with them and then do something. A couple days ago, I was just endlessly reading about Frances Harper, trying to understand who she was, trying to remember, gather up facts and stories and images and words. And then that night, I had a dream. And in the dream, I was in some open-air cafe. And maybe several different restaurants, sort of like nearby, and people were gathered around. And I felt a tap on my shoulder, and I turned around, and there was this young woman, this black woman, looking me in the face, and she said, "We need to speak with you." And I went around. There was something about her face, like she was familiar. I was trying to figure out who she was, and something very intelligent about her. Like she had that kind of diffident confidence of teenagers, maybe about 17 years old, looking me, challenging me in a certain way, demanding something of me. And I went around, and there were all these people were people that I knew, people I'd worked with, people that I had been in protests with, people I'd been in meetings with. They're all African-American people. And they had some question that really was kind of irrelevant question about something that I had tweeted online. And then I didn't know what I said. "If I remember anything, I'll let you know." I said, and then they said, "Well, we're leaving." And they got up to leave, and the young woman was still there. And I looked at her, I thought, "Who is this? Who is this?" And I said, "What's your name?" And she said, "It doesn't matter. It's them. They are the people you need to listen to. They are the people you need to know." Ellen Harper was reminding me that not to focus on her place in Unitarian Universalism, but to focus on the people who are still in the struggle, who are still struggling to make this a world of love and harmony and justice and wholeness. Some time ago, a song was written meant as the Black national anthem. When I first started singing this song, we'd always sing it fast. Lift every voice and sing till earth and heaven ring. Right? When I went into Black churches, they sang it, and this is in Muncie, Indiana, they would sing it very slow, very wistful, very sad. It was not a happy dancing march to victory, and yet the words resonate with joy and hope and power. And so I invite all of you, either in spirit or in body or both, to rise and to sing, Lift Every Voice.
We extinguish this chalice, but not the light of truth.
We extinguish this chalice, but not the light of truth.
The warmth of community or the fire of commitment.
The warmth of community or the fire of commitment.
These we carry in our hearts until we are together again.
These we carry in our hearts until we are together again. Go with the song of unity. Go with the hope of unity. Go into this good world and do good for others. So may it be.